My name is Matt Bennett. I'm Executive Vice President of Third Way. I'm delighted to welcome you to this discussion on education polarization among voters of color. One programming note, this event is being recorded, it is on the record, and we will put this on our website in a couple of days for you or anyone you like to reference. Now, as Mo Elleithee knows, because he and I worked together ages ago, I have been in politics a long time. And when I started back in the early Middle Ages, I was putting together events for the Dukakis campaign in California and Maryland in late October of the general election. That is unimaginable today, but because both states obviously have become extraordinarily reliable blue Democratic states, even as others that we took for granted back then have kind of trended the other way. So it's been clear for a long time that politics, coalitions are not often permanent, but we've always assumed that they tended to move as kind of evolutions and not revolutions. Yet in the last couple of election cycles, we have seen a shift in the Democratic and Republican Party coalitions that have been both fast and kind of staggering. Now, in the modern era, Democrats have always presumed that we would win among voters of color, Northeastern liberals, and working class voters in the industrial Midwest. And Republicans were supposed to win among religious conservatives and affluent suburban white voters. But Donald Trump and the 2016 election just scrambled all of those coalitions. And then after that, Democrats started winning pretty big chunks of college-educated women in the suburbs, and Republicans started winning overwhelmingly with non-college educated voters. Now, when I say non-college Trump voters, I know that a very particular image pops into one's head, which is a white man. But it's not only white non-college voters who are moving to the right. After the 2020 election, a pattern within these broader trends became apparent. Americans are becoming increasingly polarized by education and a little bit less polarized by race. This is especially pronounced among Latino voters who are trending towards Republicans, particularly the non-college Latinos. And a similar thing may be taking hold among Asian voters who unexpectedly helped deliver some districts to Republicans in 2020. With Black voters, as we'll hear, these trends are a little bit less pronounced, but because Democrats are so reliant upon Black voters, any movement among those voters is a tidal wave for Democrats. So this is a big topic, a lot of material to cover. There are people on here much more expert than me. That's why we're very excited to be joined by this august panel that will be led by my friend Mo Elleithee. Mo is the executive director of Georgetown University's Institute of Politics. He has decades of experience in politics. He was the communications director and the chief spokesperson for the DNC. He was a senior spokesman and traveling press secretary for Hillary Clinton in 2008. He's been a senior advisor to Tim Kaine, and I worked with him on the Wes Clark's campaign. He's been at this a long time. And he is joined by this great panel, and I'm going to turn it over to Mo to take it from here.
Thanks so much, Matt, to you and to Third Way. I'm honored to be here. And Matt's being far too generous. We didn't just work together. He was my boss on that campaign. And I think I can say with certainty that was the most deferential I've ever heard him be towards me. So I appreciate the kind words. Look, I'm excited for this conversation now that I'm in my ivory tower of academia and out of the trenches. These are the types of things I think a lot about. And this is a great panel to help us think it through. I'm going to introduce them in one moment, but let me just tell you how this is going to work. For the next 20 minutes or so, 25 minutes or so, I've got a few questions that I want to ask the panelists, and we're going to have a conversation amongst ourselves. But we want to very quickly bring you and the audience into the conversation. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see the Q&A tab. Feel free at any point during the program to start populating that feed with your questions. And I'm going to be keeping my eye on it, and we'll pull from your questions, which undoubtedly will be better than mine, as we progress through the conversation. And to have that conversation, as Matt said, we've got a pretty remarkable panel. Political scientist Ruy Teixeira, who's a fellow at the Center for American Progress and author of the widely cited Substack, The Liberal Patriot, someone whose work I have followed for years, excited to be in conversation with you. Quentin James is founder and president of the Collective PAC, which works to increase the representation of the Black community at all levels of government. And Aliza, Astrow, political analyst at Third Way, who recently authored a report on education divides among Black, Latino, and Asian voters. And so let's jump right into it. And Aliza, I'm going to turn to you first, because you just wrote this report that is really sort of the catalyst for this conversation. Why don't you take a couple minutes and tell us what you found?
Yeah, so something that I had been interested in education polarization and sort of divides among both white voters, but also non-white voters by education. But I had noticed that there's like a really tragic lack of data on this subject. If you look at, for example, Catalyst is a Democratic data firm, and they have really great data on elections and on recent voter trends. But if you looked at the crosstab for voters of looking at trying to figure out education divides among voters of color, the crosstab was just voters of color, college, and voters of color, non-college, which is a really just nonsensical conglomeration of a very diverse array of people. So I wanted to look into that a little bit further and sort of figure out why some of these voters are moving away from us, why Democrats have seen a drop off with non-college voters of color in recent years. So my key finding was basically that on certain key social issues, non-college voted Black, Latino, and Asian voters were somewhat more conservative than their college-educated counterparts. And so it wasn't that they were necessarily as conservative as non-college white voters. It wasn't, it would be the pipe dream of the Republican Party to say that non-college Latinos are just like non-college white people. That's not true. But they were in several issues like 10 to 15 points more conservative on issues like guns and abortion than the college-educated Black, Latino, and Asian voters. And another key finding was just that voter opinion is cross-pressured on a lot of these issues. And so if you ask a lot of these questions on these tricky political issues like abortion and guns and same-sex marriage and economic issues as well, like the minimum wage, if you ask these questions in different ways, voters respond with pretty different answers. And so that was a really important finding about how some of our polling is done, that you can kind of find people's responses, voters' responses. If you're looking for a certain answer, you can probably get it, but it's much better to ask in a couple different ways to get at what voters really think on some of these tough issues.
So let me bring both Ruy and Quentin into the conversation, let you both kind of respond to give us your thoughts on the findings. To me, it's really interesting because, for years we have heard people say, or at least for the past, decade or so, people say that, the greatest predictors of how people vote are geography, right? Urban versus rural, our income level, our education level, and race. But it seems to me that what we're finding here in this report, if I'm reading it correctly, is that sort of when you look at that nexus of education level and race, you start to see some real divergences. So I'd love to hear both of your takes on this. Ruy, why don't we start with you? Yeah,
okay,
go ahead.
Yeah, no, I thought Aliza's report was very good. I mean, it's a very solid analysis of the CES data, Congressional Election Study data. I look at a lot of different data sets, and to be honest, it's my impression that the divergences between college and non-college that are found in the CS data, if anything, underestimate the actual level of education polarization. There's some reasons for that, but I won't go into them. So, I mean, this is a real phenomenon. Let me give you a little stylized fact that comes out of the Catalyst data that sort of, I think is compelling in terms of what's happened since 2012. If you look at the Catalyst data, there's been a 19-point margin shift towards the Republicans, comparing these two elections, 2012 and 2020, among non-white working class or non-college voters. There's been a 16-point shift toward the Democrats among white college graduate voters. So you know, you could unpack that in a lot of different ways, but I mean, I think there's a lot of signal there in that noise. I mean, that's a real phenomenon. And I think one thing that's really key about the obvious move of more moderate to conservative non-white working class voters toward the Republicans is it really complicates and in a sense challenges the Democrats to look very carefully at what is happening with the electorate and their previous assumptions. Because I think after 2016, when Trump got elected largely on the back of white working class voters, big national shift, but especially big shifts in key states in the Rust Belt and some other places. I think a lot of Democrats kind of whistled past the graveyard and convinced themselves, well, you know, what do you expect? White working class voters, they're, you know, they're racist, they're reactionary, they're xenophobic. This is all that this is about. You know, and there's nothing we can do about that. So there's a certain level of complacency toward the working class population. And the embedded assumption sort of behind that assumption, not even articulated, was the idea, well, those white working class voters don't really count. The real working class voters are non-whites, blacks, Asians, Latinos, right? So we got them, no problem. I think what is really interesting and critical and really affected my thinking was what we saw in the 2020 election, where we had these big margin shifts toward the Republicans among Hispanic voters, you know, like roughly a 16-point or 18-point shift, depending on the data set you look at in terms of margin points. So this is a big deal. And furthermore, you find, I mean, we found this in our data in our States of Change project. You see it in the Pew data. It's implicit to some extent in the Catalyst data, though they don't break out Hispanics. The biggest driver of that shift of Hispanic voters toward the Republicans was on Hispanic working class voters. I mean, big shifts. So this really raises the question, you know, what is happening with the party, you know, basically the party of the working class in America? It's supposed to be the Democrats, right? Like I say, it was a little easier to dismiss the problem when it was just white voters who at that level of education who were bailing out. But now if we see more and more Hispanic, Asian, and Black voters, particularly Hispanics bailing out, I think that really challenges the Democrats to think very carefully about what they're doing and how they're presenting themselves to people, because the Democrats cannot survive, well, they've survived, but they can't bid to become a solid and dominant majority party without much better performance among the working class. I would include obviously not just the white working class. Now we're talking about the non-white working class as well. And I think there's, again, to this day, I think there's a lot of complacency about that and a lot of inability to recognize the scale of the challenge.
Quentin, as someone who's runs an organization dedicated towards reaching a lot of these voters, at least in the Black community, would love your thoughts.
Thank you all so much. It's a pleasure and honor to be here. Yes, what keeps me up at night is the enormous problem we have with not just, again, as previously mentioned, the huge shift of support that we've seen from people of color voters or non-white voters, but we have a huge turnout problem as well that I think folks just really aren't grappling with and understanding. We looked at the results from about 23 states from the 2020 election, where we see large swaths of Black voters. And the only racial and age demographic that voted under 50% were 18 to 35-year-old African Americans across the country. There's about a 15-point gap between Black and white young voters. And that's a huge problem that no one kind of wants to address. We have about a 20-point turnout gap of Black men compared to Black women. And so when we think about this issue of education, we think about what we've seen happen to young people, particularly young Black men over the past decade or two. We know that's directly tied to educational outcomes, but also tied to what we're doing in our policing and criminal justice system as well. And so these issues intersect, but it is one that we are very concerned about, not solely on the support level, but particularly on the turnout level. If less than half of registered African Americans between 1835 are voting, that not only has an immediate impact on elections, but a long-term impact. If you think about a traditional population pyramid, you're going to see less people who are older and more who are younger. Where in the Black community, the voting pyramid exactly flipped upside down. It's a whole 180, where we see the majority of Black voters being older. And while we have a huge number of young Black people, they're not showing up to vote. And so as we saw through the pandemic and the large numbers of people who were older Americans, dying, as older African Americans, again, begin to transition and no longer be with us, we have to replace those individuals with voters. And right now we're not doing that. And so this has generational impact on the future of progressive and democratic politics over the next few cycles if that turnout level does not increase amongst young Black people, particularly young Black men. We've never seen numbers like this, at least in the kind of recent turnout elections, since we can look at 08 to now. And so that's a huge concern. And I think the inroads that Donald Trump and the Republicans made with the Black community should definitely not be underestimated as we look forward to the midterms into the 2024 election. So whether some people want to blame it on Russian influence or misinformation or disinformation, like no matter the cause, it has really persisted beyond the 2020 election. We're seeing these issues in other elections, many of them on the municipal level over the past few months. I think the Los Angeles mayor's race is a good example. What we saw happen in New York City, what we saw happen in San Francisco and other places, where we're seeing, again, this kind of combination of Black people being really concerned about issues like education, where the Democratic Party and progressive candidates are on those issues, but also feeling as though at the end of the day, government is not doing anything to solve their problems. And that is, again, a major concern, something that we're trying to work on. But if I can just be very transparent to you all, I don't think folks on our side of the aisle are really seeing this as big of an issue as it really is when it comes to this November and future Novembers over the next couple of years and cycles.
So let me pick up that thread and run with it a little bit, because both Quentin and Ruy, you both just talked about sort of the two pieces really of what every campaign does, right? If I could put on my old campaign flack hat, every campaign has to do two things. It has to turn out, mobilize, and it has to persuade. And after listening to the two of you, I'm hearing you say that there's a problem on both those sides with non-white, non-college educated voters. So I guess my question is, and Quentin, you started to talk about this a little bit, but for all three of you, I'd love your thoughts. What are both parties doing about it, right? Like why? The numbers show what they show. Is it an abandoning of the Democratic Party? Is there something appealing in the Republicans' message or issue set that they're choosing? Talk a little bit about what's going on, why it's going on.
Yeah, I'll kind of jump out here first. I think the problem that we will never be able to kind of change within the Democratic Party is we're a big tent party. And so if you're gonna move policy to help Black people, you better be ready to move policy to help Latino Americans and women and young people and everybody else. And right now our party is not being able to prioritize policy that has major impact across all those communities. And what we've continued to see over time is the Black community, and particularly Black men, right? Because I think if we think about George Floyd and everything that we learned, right? A lot of us had already knew it, but a lot of Americans learned is that our country for the past 2 to 3 decades has been targeting Black men in a way that is unacceptable, right? Whether it be over policing, or under-resourcing education. Those two go hand in hand. And so, how does the Democratic Party fix that? We, in my opinion, have yet to see very clear policy proposals that will do that, because in my opinion, it's tough for the party to say we're going to support Black people and get it done in an environment in a country where, in my opinion, we're very much racially polarized right now. And so I think when you have the populism growing on both sides, the party itself is trying to keep together the large base, but it kind of forgets that you got to pull together women and young people and LGBT folks and Black folks, and we just haven't done a good enough job, in my opinion, of balancing that act out. The last one I'll say is campaigns for the past 2 decades have decided that it is too expensive and too time consuming to turn out Black voters who aren't your generic turnout, upper middle class, educated African Americans. And so until we change that perspective on our politics, we're gonna leave millions of Black voters on the table because we're not spending any money to turn them out, right? This is no longer, to your point, Mo, a October problem. We have to view Black voters as a persuasion demographic group, and that's gonna be more time consuming and more expensive. And so it becomes an issue of resources, time and money, but we haven't made the decision that we wanna invest in those Black voters in a way that we need to win elections moving forward.
Yeah, no, I agree with that point about persuasion. I mean, I think that there are like 2 problems with the Democrats' approach to sort of ginning up the electorate for, the 2022 election, but, it applies to a lot of others as well. On the one hand, they put a lot of emphasis on, whatever the sort of hot button issues are out there on their side, be it January 6th, be it schools, be it, sort of the don't say gay law in Florida. I mean, there's a lot of things that really just freak out liberals. And Democrats are pretty attuned now to the interests and levels of concern about, of their liberal college educated base. So, they sort of think, well, we can save this election coming up by talking about the ultra MAGA Republicans. But I think already people are realizing, that doesn't work. That's not what people are worried about. That's not how you persuade people. That's how you get people who are already going to vote for you to feel even more angry. So, I think that really applies, I think, to these kind of non-white working class, Black, Hispanic. So when we're talking about, they need to be convinced the Democrats are on their side and they have, something for them. They can't just like trot out the usual, sort of hot button issues and say, Republicans evil, vote for us. And I think to some extent that is still what's happening. And I don't think it's going to work very well. I mean, just to look back in the 2020 election for a second, there was the George Floyd moment, and there was an enormous amount of action around it, and it became a big part of how Democrats thought they would corral the voters of color vote, all writ large in that election. The problem is it didn't really work, right? I mean, it was something they needed to talk about, but it wasn't enough. They actually got there was a margin shift against the Democrats among Black voters. So we've discussed even more among Hispanic voters, among Black voters who you would have thought would respond to this appeal with a tsunami of turnout. Their turnout did go up some, but not as much as other groups. So, in places like, there's actually a number of states who are key, like in Georgia, where there's Black voter share actually went down slightly. So it just shows it's so complicated to get people to support your side. And you have to, reach out to them. You have to persuade them. You have to make, an offer they find compelling. It is enough to say, we're the party that stands for X, and the Republicans, they're just bad because they want to do Y. People are a lot more complicated than that. And particularly when you're talking about working class, non-white voters, they don't relate to politics in the way a lot of liberal, more educated voters in the Democratic coalition do. They don't read the papers. They don't follow, a lot of these debates and so on. They're not probably watching the January 6th hearings. I mean, you got to get real about what people are most concerned about, what really animates them, and what could really make them think the Democrats are the party on their side, and it's vitally important to get out there and vote for them. And I think there's, again, a lot of complacency about this.
Yeah.
Aliza, I'd love for you to weigh in on this as well, and maybe also shine some light on not just what Democrats are doing wrong with these communities, but what are Republicans doing anything right? Like why, particularly with the Hispanic and Latino population, we actually saw not just a turnout issue, right, but an actual movement among some parts of that community towards Republicans. What's the deal there?
Yeah, so something I've seen in Democratic circles discussed a lot is, so Biden's approval rating is like way down with younger Black voters right now. And I'm seeing a lot of analysis of like, okay, maybe it's this issue, maybe it's because Biden hadn't canceled student debt yet, or maybe it's, you know, one reason or another. And the reality is most voters are concerned with inflation and gas prices right now. And we don't need to overcomplicate this so much. Most voters are pretty concerned with the economy. They want to be able to basically lead a good life, and Democrats need to be telling stories about how the government can work for them and can actually benefit their lives. And so I think to some extent right now, you know, Democrats are the party in power, and there's inflation and gas prices are really high, and Republicans are going to reap the benefits of that. But also I think just Republicans have done a better job of showing how they can benefit voters on the economy, and voters feel more confident that Republicans can benefit them on the economy. And Democrats, again and again, we see in polling, we ask questions like, who's the party more focused on the economy? And it's always Republicans. And it's like, who's the party that's focused on social issues or the culture war? And people think that's Democrats, which is so frustrating because in my eyes, it's Republicans who are ginning up these culture war issues, but it's not breaking through that Democrats are focused on issues that are going to just improve people's everyday lives. And so I think that drives a lot of support towards Republicans.
Yeah, I'd slightly dissent from the idea it's just Republicans that are ginning up the culture wars. I think the sad reality of this, the Democrats have become identified with the entire series of cultural positions, social issue positions that are in fact are considerably to the left of the median voter, and in fact aren't attractive to a lot of the electorate they need to reach. And of course, the Republicans respond to the Democrats dialing it up to 10 by dialing up to 11 on their side. But I don't think the Democrats can be let off the hook here in terms of culture war stuff. My line on this has been for a while, it's the Republicans who benefit most from the culture wars at this point. And so Democrats, if they were smart, would move to the center on cultural issues, be much more moderate, and then make their case on some of the other issues you were talking about, Aliza. But that doesn't seem to be happening, or at least, you know, very sort of sporadically.
Just a reminder to the audience, we have just under 15 minutes left, and I'd love to get to some of your questions, so feel free to submit them at the using the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen. I want to go back to a point that Aliza made in the very, very beginning, which was, you know, we tend to look at, you know, in the polling, they kind of lump all the different groups together, right, into one big monolithic, non-white, non-college educated category. And there are obviously differences between different communities. We talked a little bit about the Black community. I talked a little bit about the Latino community. We haven't spoken much about AAPI in the Asian American community. And one thing we know is that, you know, first generation Asian Americans tend to be lower educated, business owners, tend to lean a little bit more conservative. Second and third generation Asian Americans have high levels of college education, tend to lean a little bit more progressive. So does that mean that over time, Asian Americans will become more progressive and follow the larger education polarization trend? Or do we think there might be more to that story?
Quentin, do you want to say something, or should I?
I think you can go ahead. I have some, you know, Georgia anecdotes, but
okay, all right. Yeah, no, I think probably not. I mean, I think that would be indeed grasping at straws. It's like a mixed effect in the Asian population. It's, you know, you get more college educated, less non-college. And even though, you know, there seem to be all these signs that Asian voters are starting to bail out, the Democrats will be saved by, you know, the more liberal inclinations of the college educated Asian population. I mean, anything's possible, but the way I read the data, especially what we've seen since 2020, is that in fact, the disaffection with the Democrats does also obtain among the college-educated Asian population. And in fact, it would be hard to see why it wouldn't, given all the debates there's been about these education issues and crime and so on. These are things that affect everybody, and this is a very upward mobility oriented population. And I think it would be strange if college-educated Asians weren't reacting with some dismay at the Democrats' move toward, getting rid of merit-based admission and, sort of perceived lowering of educational standards, less emphasis on measures of achievement. This is Asians, nothing's more important to the Asian population than education, nothing. And the Democrats are now becoming identified with an approach to education that seems to them, to these voters, to counter what they want to succeed in doing, and what, in terms of the college educated, to some extent, they've already succeeded. They're living they're moving up in America, and they want their kids to move up too. And Democrats are becoming identified with an approach that would, let's face it, would be lessen their chances, or would, devalue things they've invested a lot in. So I'm very skeptical that changing education mix, educational upgrading in the Asian voter population will have much of an effect if overall trends among Asian voters are to be more questioning and more disaffected with the Democrats.
Yeah, I mean, the only things I would add is, in 2020, we did see a little bit of a surge of the AAPI community in certain states, like Georgia, right? Due to donors really investing in turning out that community.
That's true. Asians were different in Georgia. That's a good point.
But what I will say, though, is I think we need to be prepared for major shifts this November, right? We know the Supreme Court is, we're going to hear a decision on affirmative action, and what that means for higher education, particularly with Asian voters. It's going to be a very interesting decision that comes out, but also a reaction, right? That comes out both from the AAPI community, but also from the Democratic Party, right? And how do we toe that line of dealing with, again, the issues of historic racism in our country, but also recognizing merit and what that also might mean for higher education. And so, again, those things aren't exclusive, right? But I think in many times they've been framed that way, at least through the courts. The last thing I'll say on this is, and this is a little bit off script here, and I apologize, but I want to share this screen with everybody. It's my favorite screen that I get to share. And this is a look at the highest ranking African Americans in Nevada, Arizona, Minnesota, and Wisconsin. And in our data systems, all these folks who we can visibly see are Black, and we know them, they are listed as Caucasian in our data systems. And so as we think about how we're talking to your point, Aliza, Black people and educated and uneducated, but we have major problems with our data systems. If these individuals, right, the highest ranking elected African Americans are listed as white, what does that mean for Joe Blow, right, who is, again, educated or college educated non-white voter? If we can identify our leaders, then we have a huge problem on the data side, not just for Black voters, but also for AAPI and every other non-white voter.
Which data set are they listed as white? I'm curious.
Those were, again, Keith Ellison in Minnesota, Aaron Ford, the Attorney General of Nevada.
Right, who classified them as white? And what?
Target Smart, our data system.
Oh, because they have a way of assessing, right? That's based on modeling and stuff. Yeah, right. Yeah. Okay, I get it.
I want to come back to the cultural issues question, and I guess this is sort of two-part. Aliza, in your report, you show that non-college educated voters across the board are more conservative than college educated voters when it comes to social and cultural issues. But when it comes to economic issues, it's less clear cut. It's a little bit murkier. So I guess part one of my question is, where do you see the biggest divide on issues between college and non-college voters, and particularly voters of color? And then part two, and this is a question that comes from the audience, Cole asks, and I think this is probably for you, Ruy, what cultural issues should Democrats moderate on? Would they benefit from moderating on? So why don't we start with the bigger question about the divergence and then go to that?
Yeah, so two of the biggest issues where there were divides by education in my report were on guns and on abortion. And so just big ticket social or cultural issues. On a question on banning assault weapons, there was about a 15-point gap between college and non-college, Black, Latino, and Asian voters, and all were in majority support, according to the survey, but there was a real gap there. And on abortion as well, there was a question about restrictions on abortion after 20 weeks, and again, all were majority in support, but there was a fairly sizable gap there. And so, and on immigration as well, there was a bit of a gap as well. So just kind of across the board on these big ticket social and cultural issues, there were pretty sizable gaps. And as Ruy says in other surveys, there might be bigger gaps.
Ruy, you want to talk about where you think Democrats would benefit on cultural issues?
Yeah, I think there's a whole series of them, but here's a by no means exhaustive ticking off of some of them. I think, obviously the biggest issue in this election coming up is the economy and inflation, gas prices, and so on. We'll see how much abortion clicks, but there's also crime, right? Crime has become a big deal for a lot of voters, and they're very upset about it. And Democrats have allowed themselves to become identified from defunding the police through, these progressive prosecutors, including Chesa Boudin, who got thrown out in San Francisco, with what people perceive to be a lax approach to law enforcement. Like reforming the criminal justice system, which actually voters tend to support, but not having enough of a focus on public safety and not being effective in that regard. So Democrats, I always like Tony Blair's slogan, tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime. At the end of the day, if you're going to get criminals off the street, you got to get criminals off the street. They had to be prosecuted. Some of them had to be put in jail. And Democrats have been pretty timid about taking that position. I would also say that in immigration, Democrats have screwed the pooch in the sense that they can't control the situation at the border. It does appear out of control. If they get rid of Title 42, there's going to be even an additional surge. Most Americans are not in favor of a lax border security regime. They're in favor of more border security. And they want us to be welcoming to immigrants, but they want it to be done in a careful and controlled basis. And this is particularly going to hurt the Democrats, the closer you are to the border, including among Hispanic voters. So that's something I think they need to get their act together and not be afraid to say, hey, yeah, we're for border security. Absolutely. I mean, people, if they want to come here, they should get in line. If there's, someone who genuinely needs asylum, we should help them, but our rules are too lax and people are gaming the system, and that's not good. Abortion, I mean, obviously very key now. The Democrats, had show votes about, a bill on abortion after the Roe, before and now after the Roe v. Wade decision, that was basically on a wish list bill that would, in essence, it made it very easy to get an abortion almost throughout one's pregnancy. And one can support that point of view or that policy, but that is not where most people in America are at. Most people in America basically support abortion on demand within the first 3 months, and then after that for rape or incest or the life of the mother, right? That's really where most people are at. And Democrats should forthrightly, adopt Bill Clinton's slogan again: abortion, safe, legal, and rare. But again, they're under a lot of pressure to take a much more extreme position. And I think that's bad. I think, this is going to be a hard fight with abortion rights. And if you're going to reach the maximum number of voters with your position, you've got to have a much more moderate position. Finally, on schools, I mean, this is a very contentious issue, but I do feel the Democrats have become identified with a level of tolerance that is not appropriate with more ideological entries into education on, anti-racist, sort of, race essentialist ideology, on gender ideology, and so on. That's allowed Republican politicians to take advantage of concern and worry among parents to promulgate laws that aren't very good laws, but they do at least respond to what people are worried about. And Democrats, if you cluster that with their move away from, they kind of screwed up the school closing thing, and then there's sort of this move away from merit-based education and so on. I mean, it's a whole mess of things that make a lot of voters think that Democrats don't seem to be focused on what schools are mostly for, which is educating people, reading, writing, and arithmetic, so they can be set to move up in the world and have a good life. That's what people want. And to the extent Democrats seem preoccupied with things that are not about that, and they may even interfere with that, I think it's to their detriment, and it gives the Republicans a big opening to pursue their own, agenda, which, can involve these relatively extreme moves like, trying to pass these various laws that could have some chilling effect in people's speech. So I think in all these issues, I think Democrats have to move to the center, have to do something that corresponds more to where the median voter is. And if they can, I think they'll get a better listen on some of the other things where their positions are already close to the median voter.
We're bumping up on the end of our time together. Quentin, I want to give you a chance, give you the final word here and give you a chance to weigh in on this topic and sort of how you view the interplay of some of these quote unquote cultural issues with non-college voters that you're trying to talk to.
Thank you, Mo, and I'll be very brief. I do think policing has to be another one that we, have to measure our tone on. We did some great research with Third Way as a result of 2020 elections, and what we saw is, and we're seeing in this cycle, and I'm here in Ohio, where now the Democratic candidate is accusing the Republican candidate of defunding the police, right? We know defund that does not help any candidates, and so we have to be moderated on the conversation, I think. And again, it's a basic combo. I was with Hillary Clinton a few weeks ago, and it was this, we need to reduce violent crime in all of our communities. That means supporting police and doing police training. And we also want to hold police accountable when they break the law or harm our communities. That's not an either or. And I don't know why it's so hard for our party to say that line and be in that middle place, but it is. And so again, thank you all so much. It's been great, and look forward to working with you all over the next few months.
I feel like we could keep having this conversation for hours. There's so much more to unpack. So let's just all agree that this is the beginning of a conversation and that we need a lot more voices to be a part of it within the Democratic family. Ruy, Quentin, thank you both for joining. Aliza, thank you for not only joining, but for authoring this fascinating report. I encourage everyone to go check it out on the Third Way website. Thanks to Third Way for bringing us all together. And with that, thank you to everyone in the audience for sharing part of your day with us. Be well, and we'll see you next time.